Welcome to my channel. I hope today's story will be something you truly enjoy. Please support me even more. Now, let's begin the story.
I'm Alice, 28 years old, and I was standing at the very back of a wedding barn packed with nearly 500 guests when my life split into a before and an after. I still remember the sound first, not the faces. Glasses clinking, polite laughter, a string quartet dragging out one last sweet note. Then my father rose to his feet, lifted his champagne glass, and turned what was supposed to be a wedding toast into a public execution. "I only have one son," he said, smiling toward the groom. "That's the child I'm proud of. The one in the back?" He didn't even look at me when he said it. Just a mistake, a disgrace to this family. A few people gasped. Most froze. Then my mother, sitting straight-backed in pale silk, gave a tiny laugh and added, "We should have put it up for adoption when we had the chance." Not her. Not my daughter. It. For one long second, nobody moved. Then the whispering started, low and hungry, spreading table to table like fire through dry grass. I smiled. I actually smiled, because if I let my face crack right there, I knew I'd collapse in front of every person they had ever performed perfection for. I picked up my purse, turned, and walked out without a word. But inside my head, something old and buried finally stood up. I had spent years building a plan for the day they pushed me too far. They just chose the stage for me. Before I tell you what he said after that, and what I did that very night, tell me this. What time is it where you are? And where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story travels. I made it to my car before my knees gave out. The barn lights blurred behind me in the rearview mirror as I drove down the long gravel road, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers cramped. I didn't cry right away. That's the strange thing about humiliation when it becomes too large to fit inside your body. Sometimes it doesn't come out as tears. Sometimes it becomes silence so cold it feels borrowed from a grave. About 20 minutes later, I pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, killed the engine, and sat there in the dark while trucks thundered past like distant storms. Then I reached into my wallet and pulled out the 3 photographs I had carried for years. They were old, bent at the corners, and soft from being handled too much. Most people keep pictures for comfort. I kept mine as evidence. The first photo was from a middle school talent show. I was 13. Wearing a cheap blue dress my aunt had altered by hand because my mother forgot to buy me one. In the photo, I'm on stage with a microphone, mouth open mid-song, smiling so hard it looks painful. What the photo doesn't show is what happened after. I had searched the audience the entire time, convinced my parents would appear late, breathless, apologetic, proud. Instead, they were across town watching my brother receive another academic trophy. When the performance ended, other girls ran into their mother's arms. I stood behind the curtain until the janitor asked if I needed help finding my ride. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom, sat on the tile floor, and pressed a washcloth so hard against my mouth to stop myself from sobbing that I threw up from the strain. I remember staring at the mirror afterward and thinking, maybe if I were better, they'd come next time. Isn't it pathetic how long a child can mistake neglect for a challenge instead of a verdict? The second photo was of me and my grandfather, Henry, taken on his porch 2 summers before he died. He had one hand on my shoulder and his old straw hat tipped back. His eyes were cloudy by then, but whenever he looked at me, he made me feel seen in a way that almost hurt. "You're the strongest one in this family," he used to whisper whenever no one else was listening. At the time, I thought he meant it as comfort. Years later, I realized it was an apology. He knew exactly what house I was growing up in. He knew what it meant that my brother's science fair ribbons were framed in the hallway while my drawings disappeared into kitchen drawers and trash bags. A week before he died, he called me into his room and asked me to promise that I would never beg for love from people too hollow to give it. I promised him, of course. Then I spent another decade breaking that promise every single day. The third photo was Aunt Ava, half turned toward the camera, laughing at something outside the frame. She had always been the family's uncomfortable truth teller, the one person who looked at me and didn't pretend not to notice the bruises that aren't visible on skin. Emotional bruises, the kind that make you flinch when someone says your name too sharply. She used to slip me books, money, and small notes that said things like, "You are not crazy. You are not difficult. You are not what they call you." Once, when I was 16, she found me crying in the laundry room after my mother told guests that I was the sensitive one, and my brother was the child with real promise. Ava held my face in both hands and said, "One day, the truth about this family will come due." At the time, I thought she meant karma in some vague spiritual sense. Sitting there on the highway after being disowned in front of 500 people, I finally understood she meant debt. Real debt. The kind that accumulates interest. I laid the 3 photos on my lap and stared at them until my breathing slowed. That was the moment the wedding humiliation stopped feeling like the end of something and started feeling like permission. My whole life, I had been trained to swallow insult, minimize damage, smooth things over, protect reputations that had never once protected me. But people like my parents only understand one language: consequences. They don't stop when you cry. They don't stop when you plead. They stop when the cost becomes unbearable. And unlike that shaking little girl in the blue dress, I was no longer waiting for them to choose me. I was done auditioning for basic humanity. I put the photos back into my wallet, started the engine, and drove home with a strange, terrifying calm. By the time I turned into my driveway, I already knew that what happened in that barn was not the worst thing they had ever done to me. It was simply the last thing. My house was dark when I walked in, but I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the entryway, heels in one hand, the other still clenched around my car keys, and listened to my own breathing. Then I went to the kitchen, opened the junk drawer beneath the phone stand, and pulled out a small black recorder wrapped in an old utility bill. I had bought that recorder 4 years earlier, back when suspicion was still something I hated myself for. Back when I still wanted to believe there had to be some hidden reason for the cruelty, some explanation that would make the whole architecture of my family less monstrous. But monsters rarely hide behind fangs. Most of them hide behind manners, church clothes, and Christmas cards. I sat at my dining table, set the recorder down, opened my laptop, and clicked through a folder labeled tax receipts. That label was fake, of course. Inside were subfolders containing copied bank statements, screenshots, photos, notes, dates, and audio files. Years of fragments, years of observing while everyone assumed I was too emotional to be dangerous. The first audio file was dated 17 months earlier. I clicked play. At first there was traffic noise and rustling fabric, then my father's voice, low and intimate in a way I had never heard him speak to my mother. "You're the only person I can be real with," he told a woman from his office, one who wore a wedding ring and smiled too brightly at company fundraisers. "My wife only knows the version of me I perform. You're the real thing." I had listened to that recording so many times that the words should have gone numb. They never did. My hand still trembled every single time. There is something uniquely grotesque about hearing the man who taught you about morality speak like a coward in love with his own reflection. The next folder held evidence of my mother's debt. She had spent years building herself into the kind of woman local magazines called graceful, philanthropic, community-minded. But beneath the tailored dresses and polished charity luncheons was a desperate gambler of a different kind. She had sunk money into investment circles, miracle wellness ventures, and private deals pitched by women who promised exclusivity, legacy wealth, and female empowerment, while quietly draining every account they touched. She refinanced things in secret, borrowed against things she barely understood, moved money between accounts, and told lies with the confidence of a woman who had never once imagined being questioned by her own daughter. I had found the first clue by accident while helping sort documents for a property dispute at my old job. One signature led to another, one overdue notice led to a lawsuit threat, and eventually, the whole elegant house of cards revealed itself. Then there was my brother Ryan, the family masterpiece. My parents praised him so relentlessly for so many years that even he started to believe admiration was oxygen, and the world owed him a constant supply. On paper, he was perfect. Brilliant oncologist, devoted son, polished public speaker, newly married golden groom. But I had watched the machinery up close. I knew how he edited stories, how he weaponized silence, how he let our parents strip me down in public as long as it preserved the hierarchy that fed him. He never had to insult me directly most of the time. All he had to do was accept the pedestal. The cruelest people are often the ones who keep their hands clean, while others do the hitting for them. I created a new document and began typing a sequence, not just a list. That was the important part. Exposing people isn't about throwing secrets into the air and hoping they land. It's about timing, pressure, witnesses, irrefutable order. I outlined what could break each one of them fastest. My father's affair could destroy his standing at the hospital foundation board where family values were practically part of the dress code. My mother's hidden debt could turn every whispering country club friend into a predator smelling blood. And Ryan's destruction would not come from scandal alone. It would come from being forced, for once, to stand without the lie that he was inherently better than me. I listened to another audio file. My father again. Same woman. This one worse. Alice always makes things heavy, he muttered with a dismissive laugh. Ryan understands what matters. He's the future. She's just baggage we never should have carried this long. I paused the recording and stared at the waveform on my screen. Baggage, mistake, disgrace. Funny how cruel people repeat themselves. They think they are being spontaneous, but contempt has such a limited vocabulary. I opened a blank message draft and started building the structure of what would happen next. Not a blind explosion, a detonation. Then I texted the only person outside the family I trusted with the truth. I need you tomorrow. No questions. Please. I sent it to Brett and closed my eyes. He replied less than a minute later. I'm there. I looked back at the folders on my screen, at the years I had spent collecting proof because some part of me must have known this day would come. If you discovered your father calling another woman the real thing, while treating you like disposable shame, how long would you stay silent? I had stayed silent long enough. That night, somewhere between midnight and dawn, my grief hardened into design. Brett arrived the next morning with black coffee, no judgment, and the expression of a man who already knew he was about to hear something ugly. We had met in college in the least cinematic way possible, over a broken printer and a missed deadline, and somehow he had become the one person in my adult life who never asked me to make my pain smaller so others could feel comfortable around it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table while I pushed my laptop toward him and said, "Before you tell me not to do this, just listen." He did. For nearly an hour, he listened to recordings, read statements, looked at screenshots, and said nothing except the occasional "Jesus" under his breath. When he finally leaned back, he rubbed both hands over his face and stared at the ceiling for a second, like he needed help from a higher power, not to kick down my parents' front door himself. "Alice," he said quietly, "this is so much worse than I thought." I gave a laugh with no humor in it. That sentence could summarize my entire upbringing. He didn't smile. Instead, he looked at me in a way that made it impossible to hide behind sarcasm. "If you go through with this the way you're thinking," he said, "you could lose whatever is left of them for good." I met his eyes and answered with a calm that surprised even me. "I lost them a long time ago. Yesterday was just the first time they made sure other people saw it too." That was when Brett reached across the table and pressed his palm flat against the folder of evidence as if physically feeling its weight. "Then don't do this messy," he said. "Do it clean." That's one reason I trusted him. He wasn't interested in melodrama. He understood systems. No vague accusations, no emotional spirals, no saying anything you can't prove. Put them in a room where they think they still control the script, then take the script away. We started refining the plan together, and it changed shape fast. I abandoned the idea of some immediate public explosion. Too sloppy. Too easy for them to paint me as unstable. We needed containment first, fracture second, exposure third. Brett also forced me to admit something I had been avoiding. This wasn't only about revenge. It was about witness. If I confronted my family in private and they denied everything, they would rewrite the story by dinner. They had been rewriting me for 28 years. "You need at least one more pair of eyes in the room," Brett said. "Preferably someone whose opinion Ryan actually fears." He meant Sophie, of course, my new sister-in-law. Smart, composed, socially respected, and until that week, still naive about the rot beneath the family portrait. Including her would increase the risk, but it would also increase the cost of lying. By noon, we had built a plan around a supposedly conciliatory dinner at my house 2 nights later. Not the very next day, too abrupt, too unbelievable. Enough time for everyone to cool down, but not enough time for me to lose nerve. I would send a message that sounded restrained and ashamed. I hated that part. But Brett was right. People like my parents are always most vulnerable when they think they've broken you back into obedience. I drafted the text in front of him. "I don't want things to stay the way they were after the wedding. We should talk privately. Dinner at my place Thursday. Please come. Bring Sophie if you want. I'd like to fix this before it gets worse." My father replied first with a terse, "We'll see." My mother sent nothing. Ryan responded 3 hours later with, "For Sophie's sake, let's act like adults." I almost laughed out loud at that. Act like adults. As if humiliating your daughter in front of 1,000 guests was a mature family tradition. The rest of the day became logistics. Brett checked my speaker system. I duplicated audio files onto a hidden drive and a cloud folder. I printed selected financial documents and sealed them in a plain envelope. I wrote down key phrases I knew could crack Ryan fastest. Not because I wanted to improvise cruelty, but because I knew that when the moment came, adrenaline would try to scramble my memory. I needed anchors, facts, precision, structure. At one point, Brett watched me labeling folders and said, "You've been preparing for this longer than you want to admit, haven't you?" I didn't answer for a while. Then I said, "I think part of me knew, even as a kid, that one day I might need receipts, just to prove I existed in the same house they pretend they raised with love." Before he left, Brett stopped in the doorway and asked the question nobody else had ever asked me straight. "After this, what do you actually want? Not what do you want them to suffer, not what do you want exposed. What do you want?" I stood there holding a stack of copied statements and realized how rare that question was in my life. "I want them to stop defining me," I said, "even in their own minds." He nodded once. "Then don't lose sight of that when they start screaming." After he drove away, I reread the dinner texts, checked the files again, and sat alone in my suddenly quiet house. What do you do when the one friend who truly sees you tells you to stop, but you know stopping would mean returning to the same slow death you've survived for years? In my case, You sharpen the plan and keep going. By Thursday evening, my house looked calm enough to fool strangers. Candles on the dining table, water glasses aligned, food warming in the oven, soft jazz in the background. I built the room the way my mother built every holiday table growing up. Tasteful, controlled, deceptive. Brett was already there, not seated with us, but nearby in the den under the excuse of helping me set up a projector for a future work presentation. If things spun out of control, I wanted one honest witness close enough to hear everything. At 6:43, headlights flashed across the front window. My pulse steadied instead of spiking. That frightened me more than panic would have. Ryan entered first with Sophie beside him, both of them dressed in that polished upper-middle-class ease my parents adored. My father followed a step behind, stiff with the kind of fake civility men wear when they think they're about to grant forgiveness they were never entitled to withhold. My mother came last, perfume first, mouth set in a line that already announced martyrdom. For the first 10 minutes we performed. Plates passed, water poured. Sophie tried to smooth the air with harmless questions about work and travel. Ryan answered in his practiced doctor voice, warm and measured. My father said little. My mother said less. Every now and then I caught one of them studying me, waiting for tears, apology, instability, anything they could categorize and use. When the main course was nearly finished, Ryan set down his fork and said, "Alice, I think we're all here because what happened at the wedding got out of hand." Out of hand. Not cruel, not monstrous, just a little disorderly. I nodded as if considering that generous interpretation. "You're right," I said. "It did get out of hand. That's why I invited all of you here. I thought maybe, for once, we could stop pretending." My father's shoulders tightened. Sophie looked from face to face, sensing the shift before she understood it. My mother gave a dry little sigh. "If this is another emotional performance," she said, "I'm not interested." I smiled at her. "No, Mom. This one comes with documents." Nobody spoke after that. I stood, walked to the sideboard, and placed a small Bluetooth speaker in the center of the table like an extra course. Ryan's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" I sat back down. "The reason this conversation is finally going to stay honest." My father pushed his chair back half an inch. Tiny movement. Huge tell. "Alice," he said, with warning now in his voice, "whatever childish stunt you think you're pulling." I pressed play. At first, the room filled with muffled traffic and static. Then my father's voice emerged, unmistakable, softer than any of us had ever heard him at home. "You're the only person I can be real with." Sophie frowned. My mother's hand froze around her water glass. The recording continued. "My wife only knows the version I perform. You're the real thing." My mother went white so fast it was almost theatrical. "Turn that off," she whispered. I didn't. My father lunged forward and hit pause himself, knocking the speaker sideways. "This is insane," he barked. "You recorded me?" I leaned back and folded my hands. "No, Dad. I documented you." "There is a difference." Sophie stared at him. "Who is that woman?" Ryan cut in immediately. "It could be edited." That was so perfectly Ryan that I nearly admired it. Evidence barely lands and his first instinct is not morality but containment. "There are 6 more files," I said evenly. "Different dates, different locations, same voice, same woman, same marriage vows being used as decorative paper." My mother made a broken sound then. Not a sob, not yet, but the noise of someone realizing humiliation has witnesses. "Mark?" she said, looking at my father like he might still hand her a version of reality she could survive in. He didn't answer. He was looking at me with naked hatred now, the kind he used to keep hidden behind disgust and disappointment. I reached for the envelope beside my plate and slid it toward my mother. "Open it." She didn't move. Open it, I repeated. Ryan grabbed it instead, tore it open, and spread the contents across the table. Overdue notices, transfer records, legal warnings, investment summaries dripping with fraud. "Mom," he said, voice suddenly thin. "What is this?" She blinked at the papers as if they had materialized from someone else's sins. "It's temporary," she said too quickly. I was handling it. I laughed then because I couldn't help it. That's the family motto, isn't it? We were handling it. We're managing it. It's not what it looks like. Meanwhile, all of you treated me like I was the unstable one because I noticed the smoke pouring out from under every door. My father slammed his palm against the table so hard the silverware jumped. "You vindictive little bitch." Sophie flinched. Ryan stood halfway up. "Dad." But I was already moving. I played the second recording. This time, it wasn't the affair that filled the room first. It was my father's dismissive laugh. "Ryan understands what matters. He's the future. Alice is just baggage we never should have carried this long." My mother closed her eyes. Ryan went still in the way prey animals do when they hear something impossible and fatal at once. Sophie turned slowly toward him, then toward me, comprehension dawning in horrible stages. "He said that about you?" she whispered. I looked at her and answered, "For years. That recording is just one time he got caught." The silence after that wasn't empty. It was pressure. My father stood so abruptly that his chair tipped backward. "This dinner is over." He grabbed his glass as if he needed something in his hand and hurled it toward the sink. It shattered against the counter, and a shard sliced across his palm. Blood hit the tile in bright drops. My mother cried out and stood, but not to comfort him, to get away from the table. Ryan looked as if the entire architecture of his life had suddenly lost load-bearing walls. "Alice," he said, and for the first time in his life I heard no superiority in my brother's voice, only fear. "Don't do anything else tonight." I met his gaze. "Anything else? You mean like tell Sophie about the nurse in Dallas? Or the resident you kept texting after midnight? Or how quickly your moral outrage disappears whenever Dad humiliates me in order to keep you shining?" Sophie's chair scraped violently backward. "What is she talking about?" Ryan turned to her so fast he nearly stumbled. "It's not, Sophie, listen to me." She was already backing away, one hand over her mouth. My mother sank into a chair that was no longer hers in any meaningful sense. My father wrapped a napkin around his bleeding hand and kept cursing at me under his breath, like language itself could restore authority. Ryan came around the table and stopped 3 feet from me. His face had emptied out. "Please," he said softly, desperately, glancing at Sophie. "Not here. Not like this. Please don't say anything else." And there it was. The golden child on bent knees without physically kneeling, begging the sister he had let them erase. When the brother you spent your life hating finally stands in front of you stripped of his halo and begging for mercy, do you forgive him? Or do you let him feel the full weight of the ladder he climbed using your back? I didn't answer right away. I let him stand in it. Let all of them stand in it. Then I said the one sentence I had waited years to say. No one at this table gets to decide my silence anymore. Everything after that moved fast, but it didn't feel chaotic. It felt precise, like the moment a building finally gives way after years of hidden cracks. Sophie pushed back from the table first, her chair scraping hard against the floor as she demanded answers in a voice sharp enough to cut through every lie in the room. Ryan followed her into the hallway, pleading under his breath, his polished calm gone so completely that he sounded like a frightened child instead of the family's perfect son. My father, meanwhile, kept ranting about legality, privacy, and betrayal, which told me everything I needed to know. He never said the recordings were false. He never denied the affair. He only cared that his secrets had been dragged into the light. My mother sat frozen, staring at the papers spread across the table as though her debt, her silence, and her years of cruelty had somehow appeared there by accident. Then she looked up at me with tears gathering in her eyes and whispered, "How could you do this to us?" That was the moment something inside me snapped clean in two. I stood so abruptly my chair crashed behind me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't lower my voice to make room for theirs. "How could I do this to you?" I shot back. "Do you want to compare damage? Because I can start with childhood and go forward from there." My voice shook, but I didn't stop. "You called me a disgrace in front of 500 people. You called me it. You said I should have been given away. And now that your own words are sitting here with proof attached, suddenly I'm the one who crossed a line?" My father stepped toward me, his hand still wrapped in a blood-soaked napkin, his face twisted with the kind of hatred he had spent years disguising as disappointment. "You were always poison," he said. "You were born looking for a reason to destroy this family." For one brief second, the old version of me heard that and wanted to fold. But the woman standing in my own dining room heard it for what it really was, a confession. Brett came in from the den then, calm and solid, not dramatic, just present enough to make it clear that I was no longer trapped alone inside their version of events. My father turned on him immediately. "Who the hell are you?" Brett didn't flinch. "Someone who knows exposure isn't betrayal," he said. That shut the room down just long enough for Ryan to reappear from the hallway, pale and sweating, with the stunned expression of a man watching his entire life crack open in real time. He looked at me and asked the question that finally revealed who he was beneath all the polish. "What do you want?" I stared at him, almost amazed. Even then, even after everything, he still thought this was a negotiation, some private cost to be settled so the family could go back to pretending. "I want the truth to stop costing only me," I said. My mother broke down fully then, crying that Ryan didn't deserve this, that his marriage was being destroyed, that this night was supposed to belong to him. I looked at her and realized she still didn't understand. "That's exactly the problem," I said. "Everything has always belonged to him, his future, his comfort, his image. You could have humiliated me at home, but you chose his wedding because even my destruction had to serve his spotlight." That landed harder than anything else. Ryan looked at me like I had ripped the floor out from under him. Then Sophie came back into the room, mascara smudged, eyes blazing, and asked him one simple question. "Is there anything else she can prove tonight that you were hoping I'd never hear?" He hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any confession could have. She let out one broken laugh, looked around the room like she was finally seeing all of us clearly, and said, "This isn't a family. This is a performance built on cruelty." Then she walked out. Ryan actually dropped to his knees in the foyer, begging her not to leave, his voice cracking so badly it barely sounded human anymore. The front door slammed a second later, and the sound echoed through the house like a verdict. One by one, they unraveled after that. My mother stumbled out in tears. My father, still bleeding and raging, threw threats over his shoulder about lawyers, consequences, and inheritance. Ryan lingered last, shattered and pale, and said, "You didn't have to do it this way." I looked him straight in the eye and answered with the calm I had earned, "You all made sure I did." Then I closed the door. By the next morning, the damage had already spread far beyond my dining room. My phone was full of missed calls, frantic texts, and voicemails. Ryan had called again and again. My mother sent one message that said only, "You destroyed us." I stared at it for a long moment and almost laughed. Even now she was rewriting the story. Not you exposed us. Not you told the truth. You destroyed us. As if I had created the affair, the lies, the debt, and the cruelty they had built for years. By noon, none of it was private anymore. Sophie had left Ryan before dawn and gone straight to her parents. She posted a cold, careful statement about discovering betrayal and deep cruelty inside the family she had just married into. She didn't name anyone, but she didn't need to. People were already talking. Someone had recorded part of the wedding toast, including my father publicly disowning me and my mother calling me it. Once those clips started circulating, the family image they had spent decades polishing cracked wide open. My father's downfall came first. Members of the hospital foundation board started asking questions immediately. Donors pulled back. Then his affair surfaced fully. And the woman involved had a husband powerful enough to make sure the scandal didn't stay quiet. By the end of the week, my father was placed on leave, stripped of his standing, and pushed out of the role he had spent his life using as proof of his superiority. He didn't just lose his job, he lost the reputation that had protected his cruelty for years. My mother fell next. Her hidden debts, fake investments, and secret financial disasters spread through the same social circles where she had always performed elegance and control. Creditors moved in fast. Accounts were frozen, legal notices followed, friends vanished, invitations stopped. By the end of the week, she was facing the loss of the house she had treated like a kingdom. Then came Ryan. He was supposed to survive it all. The golden son always does. But Sophie didn't stay silent. She started comparing timelines, messages, and lies, and what she found was enough to destroy the marriage almost immediately. The annulment process began before the wedding flowers had even died. At the hospital, whispers followed him too. Questions about his behavior, his late-night messages, and his professionalism started spreading. He didn't lose everything at once, but he lost the one thing he valued most, the myth that he was untouchable. On the 7th night after the wedding, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, all three of them were there. My father looked gray and hollow. My mother was crying in the car. Ryan stood on the porch, like a man who had aged years and days. "You made your point," my father said. "This has gone far enough." I looked at him and answered, "No, it went far enough when you erased me in front of 500 people." Then my mother stepped out, shaking, and said, "Please, we've lost everything." Ryan came forward last, and this time he really did kneel. Right there on my porch, the golden sun on his knees looking up at the sister he had spent his whole life letting them destroy. "Please," he whispered, "tell people it isn't all true. Tell Sophie I can fix this." I looked at him for a long moment and said, "You're not here because you finally understand my pain. You're here because losing me never hurt you. Losing yourselves did." None of them could answer. I stood there looking at the family that had called me a mistake and felt something I had never felt before: peace. "I was never the mistake," I said. "I was the consequence." Then I closed the door and left them outside with the ruins they had built themselves. The team behind Revenge Argon is always working hard to create meaningful and engaging scripts that leave viewers with valuable lessons. We want to make it clear that this story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment and educational purposes, with the goal of sharing thoughtful messages and life lessons with our audience. Now that you've heard the story, which character did you like the most? And what kind of story theme would you like to see next on Revenge Argon?